Sorcerers are one of the most popular classes, maybe the most popular in the Elder Scrolls Online. They have great damage, one of the easier combat rotations, and it's always a great idea to have at least one in your group for the extra 6% spell critical chance that they provide everyone through their passives. There aren't too many changes from my previous Blackwood guide, but we do have a lot of new gear options and some interesting things to update with the Deadlands DLC. I also won't be going over the 1 pet and 0 pet setups in this video, but I will have some resources for those in the description from previous guides if you are interested, but the rotations and skill bar setups haven't really changed for those. And I'm going to keep stressing this at the start of these videos, but please remember, treat this guide as a base to work from. Always make adjustments based on your needs if certain tweaks here or there will get you better results for the specific content that you're working on. I'll try to give a lot of options that work well, but I can't possibly cover every scenario in the game. And do make sure to check the description as well. I'll try and put notes if anything does change from what is presented in this video. Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this is my Magicka Sorcerer DPS guide updated for the Deadlands DLC. So for this video, we'll go through the top races, our Mundus stone, the food, drinks, and potions we'll be using, our champion points, a lot of gear options for both boss setups and AoE trash setups, and I'll make sure to cover some easy to get options as well, our skill bars, a few rotations including both dynamic and static options, and even a beginner rotation, a rundown of a bunch of the setups I tested with and how they turned out, so a bunch of the different gear combos and the DPS that I got with them, and then we'll end with a few clips of these builds in action on the trial dummy. And one quick thing before we start, if you want to see how you can help support this channel and keep these guides coming, stop by my Patreon page. I'll have it linked in the description. There are ways to support for as little as $3 and it really does help. Or just throwing a like on this video and subscribing for free here on YouTube helps a ton too. Alright, let's go ahead and get into it. For our top race options, for pure damage, High Elves and Dark Elves are tied at the top. With the new cap on critical damage, Khajiits do take a little bit of a hit from previous patches for optimized group play and are roughly 2 to 3% behind now for Magicka Sorcerers in those scenarios. However, if you are playing solo or if your group isn't reaching that 125% crit cap, then Khajiits are still pretty much neck and neck with High Elves and Dark Elves for damage. And they also get some extra health and sustain to go along with their damage passives that you won't get with those other two races. So depending on your situation and what you like to do in the game, Khajiit might be the better pick for you. Bretons are a little further back in damage at closer to 4% or so behind, but have some nice resistance buffs and the best sustain passives for Magicka based characters. Orc is also a pretty good option, somewhere between the Khajiit and Breton for damage. They also get a nice health boost and passive healing, but no help with Magicka sustain. So personally, if I had to choose between Breton and Orc, I'd still go with the Breton, even though they are a tiny bit behind Orc for damage. If you really want to go with one of the other race options, you can definitely still do that too. I played an Imperial Magicka Dragonite for quite a bit of content, and even though they have no Magicka based damage passives, I still was able to do really well with it. Imperials get a nice boost to their health and cost reduction to all of their abilities, so even though I didn't have any racial passives that boosted my damage, I did have some benefits there. So even the worst racial options for Magicka based DPS are only going to be about 6% or so behind, and like I said, they might have some other side passives that are still beneficial. Ultimately, pick what you like, but just know that in highly optimized scenarios, High Elves and Dark Elves are just slightly ahead of the pack for how much damage they can bring. For our Mundus stone, we'll be going with the Thief. With the new cap on crit damage, it is a little too easy to hit the cap without the Shadow Mundus now. If you are playing solo though, in a very high crit chance setup, it is possible the Shadow could perform a little better for you, if you're not already hitting that crit cap, but generally in most situations, the Thief is going to be the best option. For food, I recommend the Bystat Health Plus Magicka if you are able to sustain it. It offers great damage with a lot of health. There is no recovery bonus though, so you will be relying on your group or skill selection a lot for sustain. If that isn't cutting it for a big boost to sustain and just slightly less damage, you can also go with Ghastly Eyeball. There is no health bonus on it, so depending on what content you're doing, you might be a little squishy. A nice middle ground between these is Clockwork Citrus Fillet. This is a little more expensive, but gives some health, magicka, and recovery. It's not as much damage as either of the other two options I listed previously though, due to the lower magicka pool. There is also a cheaper version of this that gives the same types of stats called Witch Mother's Potent Brew. The stats on it are a little lower than Clockwork, but it can be run if gold is an issue. For our potions, for most scenarios, we are using the standard spell power potions. These are generally expected for a DPS to run in veteran encounters, but there are situations where you might not want to use them, such as running easier content, where you might just want to run trash potions or the daily login potions. In that case, you'll just want to make sure that you are still set up to receive your major prophecy and major sorcery if you go this route. There are a few different ways to accomplish that, usually inner light for the prophecy and one of the following, either degeneration, crit surge, or a dragonite support casting igneous weapons for the sorcery. This might mean dropping down to a 1-pet setup to make room for the extra skills you need. This will be a small DPS loss, but like I said, for easier content might be worth it over wasting gold on expensive potions. Definitely try to run the spell power pots for veteran content though, because every little bit of extra DPS helps. For the champion points, I won't be covering the fitness tree, but there are a lot of good slottable nodes there that will vary from situation to situation. For practicing on the dummy though, just make sure you at least have rejuvenation slotted for the recovery. So let's go through the blue warfare tree. The slottables we'll be taking for both the trial dummy and boss encounters are Backstabber, Master at Arms, Deadly Aim, and Fighting Finesse. For those situations where you can't flank and use Backstabber, Wrathful Strikes looks pretty decent. However, depending on your specific skill loadout, it is possible Biting Aura or Thaumaturge could do better in that slot, especially for fights with heavy AoE phases. But for most standard Magsork setups, Wrathful Strikes should squeak out just slightly ahead of those two for single target damage. This is probably what you'd swap in for Fighting Finesse if you happen to be a Khajiit and are trying not to go over the crit cap as well. And then for AoE encounters, if you do have enough champion points to easily swap nodes on the fly, I like to swap in Biting Aura instead of Deadly Aim if I do not have my Destro ult ready. And then if I am dropping my Destro ult on the particular wave, I'll also swap out either Fighting Finesse or Master at Arms for Thaumaturge, since the Destro ult usually does well over 50% of our damage for most trash waves. This is just being a little picky with some extra CP node flexibility, but Deadly Aim is the main one you don't want to run for your AoE trash setups if you can get away with swapping it off. Alright, now let's go over the gear. With the Deadlands update, there are so many viable options now. It's really hard to narrow it down to a smaller, digestible format, but I'll try my best to cover the top combos without rambling on for too long. I won't be covering what each of these sets do. I did do a video covering all of the top DPS sets where I run through them a little more in depth. If you are interested in checking that out, the link will be in the description. Starting out, we'll go through some boss setups that include a Mythic item. Generally, if you're using a Mythic, you'll pair that with a one-piece Slime Craw for the Monster Helm, but for some scenarios, you might not be at the pin cap, maybe solo or an unoptimized group setup. Valkynscoria or Krog could be a nice one-piece option as well. Then for the body set, Bahsei's Mania is our strongest option still. That has not changed. If you don't have Bahsei, Mother's Sorrow and False God are still really good options for body sets as well. Then for the main Mythic we'll want to use when we can, we're going with the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt. This is not viable for all encounters in the game, but on the ones that it is, you definitely want to slot it because it's a pretty big DPS boost. Next up, for the sets that we will wear on the jewelry and weapons, the ones that seem to perform the best are Pillar of Nirn, Kinra's Wrath, Advancing Yokita, also called Berserking Warrior, and Zogvin's Warband. Some other sets that do really well but seem just a little behind are Yondir's Might, Sororia, Medusa, and Burning Spellweave. If the set you happen to be front barring is also a light set, you could also set that up as 3 body pieces in your weapons and then run Bahsei jewelry, but all of the top tier ones here are either medium or heavy, so you don't have that option there. If you can be in melee range for the whole encounter, daggers are a little bit more DPS than using a fire staff, but if you need that flexibility of movement or just want to play at ranged for the whole encounter, an Inferno staff is still definitely a great option. And then our back bar will be the Maelstrom Inferno staff as usual. One thing I really like about Pillar of Nirn compared to those other 3 tier 1 options is that there's no building up of stacks. Kinra's, AY, and Zogvin all have stacks that you have to build up and maintain, while Pillar is just a proc that hits after 1 second and puts a damage over time effect on anything that it hits. The drawback to it though, since it is a proc, it will lose out to flat stat sets if you start going beyond the damage levels that are obtainable on the raid dummy, but for the DPS levels I was at and below, especially single target damage, it should be a really strong option. For our traits, all divines on the body, all bloodthirsty on the jewelry, precise on the front bar staff, and infused on the back bar staff. If you are running daggers, Nern and charged is probably the best bet for single target damage, or Nern precise for a tad bit more AoE. You can also do precise and charged if you find your crit chance with your build is pretty low and your weapon and spell damage is already really high. It kind of just depends, and all of those setups are really pretty close to each other. Just make sure if you are running Nernhoned, it's in your main hand. None of the other traits matter. For some other good mythics you might run here, first we have the Pale Order Ring. This one is really good solo or maybe in a 4-man group with no healer to add in some extra passive healing. So you'll move whatever piece you have on your ring slot and put that on your legs instead of the kilt, and then slot the Pale Order Ring if you want to set up that way. You could also do the same with the Death Dealer's Ring if you want to play a bit safer and have a larger health pool to work with while still having a nice boost to your resources for some damage as well. And then for solo and 4-man stuff, if you want to play a little bit riskier, you can use the Thracian Strangler gloves. Just keep in mind, you have to get to 50 killing blows to max the set out, so only good situationally when you can actually get the stacks up. And they are removed on dying or changing zones, so just something to keep in mind there. But 1150 weapon and spell damage at max stacks is pretty strong for a one-piece set. Alright, now we'll go through some boss setups that use a full monster set. With monster sets being able to crit now, they are a really great go-to on fights where the kilt is not your best option. And even directly comparing to the kilt, they're only a few K DPS behind. So most of the setup here is the same, but we'll have our body set on the legs now instead of the shoulders, and then we'll slot the 2-piece monster set on the head and shoulders. My favorite options are Maw of the Infernal. It's really good for single target damage. Velodreth is really great for AoE damage, especially if you can stack up close to the pack of enemies. It does lose some effectiveness the further out you are because of the trajectory of the spores, so having them all hit up close is really strong. Hjalnar is also really good for single target damage, but it works as a debuff on the enemy, and therefore only one set can be used at a time. So if no one else in your group is running it, definitely a strong option. I squeaked out a tiny bit more from that than I did with Maw of the Infernal on the parses that I did, which I'll go over a bit later, but both of those are really strong for single target damage. Iceheart is always a nice option if you're trying to play a bit safer, and Alambris is a nice alternative to Velodreth for AoE damage if you are ranged and your spores from Velodreth aren't consistently hitting all the enemies very well. And then Narayanth is nice if you're using Force Pulse as your spammable. It does work off a % chance to activate with direct damage, so since Force Pulse is 3 hits in 1, you get a little bit extra chance to proc it, and it hits pretty hard with a short 3-second cooldown. I probably wouldn't use it with other single hit spammables though. And then finally, Stormfist is pretty strong for AoE as well, and the Sorcerer's Energized passive boosts both components of the damage by 5%. The one piece being Stam Recovery hurts it a bit, but the proc itself still does really nice damage. And then I did want to mention, if you haven't had a chance to grab these combinations yet, I'll quickly go through some other easy to get early options in addition to what we've already gone through. Law of Julianos and Heartland Conqueror are both nice craftable sets. I did some parses in these too that I'll show later. And then Unfathomable Darkness is an easy to pick up overland set that has pretty nice single target damage on it. Not quite as high as some of these other options we just went over, but it's not far off and it's a nice option to grab early on. Another setup I ran that I thought was a little off the normal beaten path was backbarring Pillar of Nirn, front barring Sororia, which leaves us room to do both the kilt and a monster set. So I'll show the results of this later on, but it was surprisingly high for losing our Maelstrom staff. I did Sororia here because I don't really love Bahsei with this, because if you front bar Bahsei, you lose that bonus each time you go to your back bar, but it could probably do okay as well if you wanted to set it up that way. Also could do a different monster set as well, like Hjalnar if you wanted, but anyways, just wanted to share this. Not quite the best results I got, but you'll see later, it wasn't too far off either. Alright, now I'll go through some AoE damage setups. These are mainly for if you like to swap gear for AoE trash waves and wear something different from what you'd normally wear on boss fights. And these setups pretty much work for any class, they aren't really exclusive to the Sorcerer. The first setup we are using is a monster set, either Velodreth, Alambris, or Balorg. 5-piece Mechanical Acuity on the front bar, a 5-piece Bahsei's Mania, and a Maelstrom staff on the back bar. I put Bahsei's Mania on the jewelry here because that does give you the flexibility to run some medium acuity pieces on the body if you want. You definitely don't have to do that. You could do acuity on the jewelry if you wanted to go that route. I generally only do this when I'm using Balorg, as Balorg gives us penetration and weapon and spell damage when we use an ultimate, so that covers our missing pen from not having light armor, and then the weapon and spell damage it gives gets boosted further by the medium armor as well. Ultimately, your exact config of light versus heavy will depend on your group and what penetration debuff sets they're running. I know a lot of people were thinking Acuity wouldn't be used anymore this patch since it had the rework, but it is still insanely strong. Here on the last ad wave before Bahsei in Veteran Rockgrove, I got over 400k DPS using this setup. I did have 5 medium pieces on, so the 3 Acuity pieces and the 2 Balorg pieces, and then 2 light pieces from my Bahsei. But I still had plenty of pen because of the Balorg proc. Nirnhoned is ideal for short burst. I still had a precise staff here, which works well if the pool lingers on a bit, but in this scenario, I would have done better with a Nirnhoned staff. And when deciding between an Inferno or a lightning staff, generally if several group members are running an Inferno, or if you have multiple DKs and the burning uptimes are really good on the enemies, the Flame Pulsar skill is a really good option for the afterburn effect that it gives to burning enemies. For less organized pug situations, probably the lightning staff would give better results on the front bar, but really either way, they're both pretty close. The damage between the two is going to be very similar, but definitely lightning if you're not running Pulsar. Alright, here's another strong short burst AoE setup. It's pretty similar, still Acuity on the front bar, but instead of Bahsei, we'll be back barring Burning Spellweave, which gives us room to run the Mythic Kilt plus a 3-piece trial set with Minor Slayer on it. Roaring Opportunist is great as that 3-piece if you want penetration, or Sororia for the spell damage. If you don't want to do the Kilt, maybe you aren't keeping stacks up well with it, or you just don't want to have to worry about not taking direct damage, you can do the Marken Ring of Majesty with this setup as well. Since we do have 2 5-piece sets and 1 3-piece set on, this maxes out the Marken bonus with 300 weapon and spell damage and 3471 armor. Side by side comparison, it is not quite as strong offensively as the Kilt, but the Kilt crit chance bonus is essentially negated during our Acuity proc, and in some scenarios you might have too much crit damage already as well. So I think Marken is a pretty nice option with this specific loadout and adds a little over 5% extra mitigation too with that armor that it gives. The last short burst setup I'll go through is again with back barring Burning Spellweave and front barring Acuity, but instead of that 3-piece with Minor Slayer, we'll be doing a 2-piece monster set. So that'll leave us with a leftover body piece, so we're running an extra Burning Spellweave piece on the body to get a little bit extra crit on your front bar when our Acuity proc fades away. Other than that, this setup is pretty similar to that last setup. Okay, so the next options we'll go through will be really nice for longer pools where Acuity might not be too ideal, or if you just want something you can wear all throughout the trash waves and not worry about cooldowns or trying to swap stuff around. Similar setup here again as before, except we have Sulksan's Torment as our best option for the front bar set. Now this set does require you to retrieve a soul from a dead body to activate the 5-piece bonus, so just something to keep in mind. You will need to be actively doing that and plan accordingly around it. Sorrow is fine to pair with Sulksan as well if you aren't running Bahsei, or you could also go with a bit more straightforward setup here and just run Bahsei with Medusa if you don't want to mess with having to pick up souls every 30 seconds. The next setup here is similar. You'll probably see a trend here. We are running Burning Spellweave on the back bar like with the other setup, and Sulksan again on the front bar. This just opens up room for the Kilt if you want to wear that, or you could do a different Mythic if you wanted to as well. And then the last setup here is for ranged encounters. I still like the Master's Lightning Staff pretty well if you can't be up in the ad wave spamming Pulsar. It does rely on the tanks having stuff stacked up tightly, or you won't get the best damage out of Shot Clench since the AoE is not too huge on it, but definitely can be a nice option. And then for the monster set, like I mentioned earlier, Veladreth loses a bit of damage from the spores at range because of the trajectory, but Alambris would still work well, and I've also seen some people doing Stormfist too. Haven't tested that one personally in AoE trash packs, but it looks like it's doing all right. Before we move on to the skills, I just want to talk about a couple of more things. The first being Azurblight Reaper. This is a really nice AoE set, but it works similar to Kjolnar where it is a debuff on the target, so you generally only have one person wearing it. I didn't include it in these builds specifically for Magsork because generally it would be better suited on another class in your group that has more damage over time effects rolling in trash, but if no one on your team is wearing it, it can still be very nice for some AoE pools. I just wouldn't prioritize putting it on a sorcerer, so that's why it didn't go in these builds. And I've seen some people trying out Prior Theeric on trash waves as well. I haven't personally tested this one yet. It seems like it could be pretty decent if the pool is very short, as it buffs all of your AoE abilities by 5% and has an AoE proc effect on the ground as well. It does have a long cooldown, so I definitely wouldn't use it on longer AoE pulls, but I do see the possible potential for short burst stuff. Alright, now let's go through the skills. I won't be going through the passives, but I'll have it down in the description if you are a little shy on skill points and looking for the essential ones to take. We'll start with our boss setup. On the front bar, we have the Twilight Tormentor, Volatile Familiar, Daedric Prey, our Spammable, which I'll get into in a sec, Crystal Fragments, and Flawless Dawnbreaker for our ultimate. Dawnbreaker is just mainly here for the passive stats we get from the Fighters Guild skill line, but is nice to use in a pinch as well. On the back bar, we have our two pets again, Unstable Wall of Elements, Mystic Orb, Barbed Trap, and the Greater Storm Atronach as our ultimate. The Storm Atro is really strong for single target damage, so that's usually what we'll run for bosses. However, if you are more focused on AoE damage, you can run the Fiery Rage ultimate as well from the Destruction line. If you do go this route, if you plan on only using the Destro ult, you can keep Dawnbreaker on the front bar, but if it is a situation where you may use your Destro and your Atro, that's why I have the Atro listed as an alternate on the front bar as well. Alright, let's go through some important notes. First, we'll talk about choosing a spammable. Force Pulse is great for extra cleave damage, as it will also hit 2 additional nearby enemies if those enemies have a status effect on them. Crushing Shock is a nice option if you need a ranged interrupt skill, and it has a lower Magicka cost. Crystal Fragments is a really hard-hitting ranged spammable. This one can take a little bit to get used to though, since it has a 0.8 second cast time, but it has a unique passive in the skill that reduces the cost of your next ability cast, so it helps a bit with sustain, and it also frees up bar space since you would normally have the skill slotted anyways for the secondary proc that deals 66% more damage and has a 35% chance to trigger when you cast a Magicka ability, but you can use it as your main spammable and it can trigger itself for that secondary proc, so you can kind of get 2 skills in one slot essentially. It does have that cast time though, so it can be annoying in situations where you might need to block a lot. It can also mess with your bar swapping, as you'll have to wait for that 0.8 seconds to pass before you'll be able to swap off of your bar if you need to go to your back bar for the next ability. But I'll get into some nice ways around that in the rotation section later. Elemental Weapon is another strong range spammable that doesn't hit quite as hard as Crystal Fragments, but it is an instant cast ability, so it can be a little easier to weave in your rotation, and the damage is pretty close. You do lose that extra bar space though, but it does add in some extra status effects and a little extra damage from the Spell Orb passive in the Psijic line as well. And then finally, Arterial Burst is a strong melee spammable if you are a vampire. So of these, for pure single target damage, Crystal Fragments is my favorite option. However, there are definitely good reasons to go with others over this depending on the scenario. So if we do end up going with Crystal Fragments as our spammable and we open up that 5th bar slot, you can slot Bound Aegis for a flat stat boost, Mage's Wrath for an execute, or really whatever other ability you need for the current situation, maybe a shield or something. It seems like the overall DPS is roughly the same between using Bound Aegis to give the flat stats throughout the entire fight, and Mage's Wrath as an execute that you use for the last 20% of the fight. However, the way a lot of encounters are designed in the game, the last section of the fight is generally what you're trying to burn through the quickest. So even though the overall DPS levels are roughly the same, depending on the encounter, it might be better to run the execute to help your group push through that last 20% just a little bit faster. Otherwise though, if you are using a different spammable, you won't have room for the execute without dropping your Volatile Familiar, and that seems to generally be a fair DPS loss to go that route for most encounters. Next, if you are having trouble sustaining, Degeneration or Boundless Storm can be slotted in place of Mystic Orb. They aren't quite as much damage, but much cheaper and have longer timers, so you have to cast them less often. Barbed Trap can be dropped for whatever other skill you might need. Maybe a heal or a shield if you're running Medusa or Zogven, since those sets already give you that minor force. Or if you are already just at the crit cap without minor force, maybe you're a Khajiit or your group has optimized for crit damage, then this is a skill that can be dropped. And one thing I found to work fairly well this patch, if you are using Bahsei's Mania, where you want to be able to hold and sustain low amounts of Magicka, it's either having Hurricane or Dark Conversion on your back bar. So if you find you don't need Barbed Trap, you could slot either of those in place of that. Wall, Orb, and Dark Conversion on the back bar are pretty nice, and you can just cast the Dark Conversion skill whenever you're coming close to running out of Magicka, or Hurricane, which is the stamina costing morph of Boundless Storm, could be slotted there if you don't need as extreme of a boost to sustain that you would get from Dark Conversion. Or you can put Hurricane in place of Orb if you're running Barbed Trap too. You'll see I did this on my higher parses with Bahsei's Mania. I had Unstable Wall, Hurricane, and Barbed Trap in those 3 non-pet back bar slots. Hurricane isn't the greatest damage, but with all the hybrid stuff now, it actually isn't awful. It was doing around 3k DPS, but having the 2 stam skills on my back bar really helped to maintain that low Magicka pool. I have seen some people taking the other morph of Bound Aegis, Bound Armaments, to accomplish this same goal of sustaining low Magicka. This one increases your light attack damage and stamina instead of boosting your Magicka pool. The light attack damage increase is actually fairly nice, not quite as much of a damage boost as you'd get from slotting Bound Aegis, but it's not far behind. But this gives you a secondary stamina costing ability to cast when you are low on Magicka. The full stacked up Bound Armaments cast does do more damage than a standard spammable cast, even though it does scale with your stamina stats. However, casting it will not trigger your secondary frags proc, since that only will trigger from Magicka abilities, so it does hurt it a tiny bit there. But the main reason I don't love this route is that it takes away my ability to slot Bound Aegis for other situations in the encounter. I really like having it on my bar as a boost for AoE trash situations, and if I have it morphed to Bound Armaments, then I won't be able to do that. On the other hand, taking the Hurricane morph, well, the skill functions still pretty much the same way. And remember, these suggestions with using these stamina morphs are only if you are having trouble sustaining or if you are specifically trying to sustain really low Magicka for Bahsei's Mania. Your other options like Mystic Orb, Degeneration, and Boundless Storm, the Magicka morphs will do a bit more damage, sustain problems aside. Alright, now I'll go through a couple of bar setups if you don't want to run spell power pots. So maybe some easy normal content, you don't want to waste gold, or maybe you're running expensive heroism potions to get your ult up quicker. So these setups will make sure that we still get those important buffs that we normally get from our spell power potions. If you want to keep the 2 pets, the setup is similar. We'll just have Inner Light on the front bar and the back bar to make sure we have our Major Prophecy buff that gives us the extra 12% crit chance. And then we'll drop Orb for Degeneration or Crit Surge for our Major Sorcery. Degeneration is going to deal damage, Crit Surge isn't, so it kind of depends if you have a healer or not, or if you need that extra healing. I'd prefer Degeneration usually, but that will give us the Major Sorcery that gives us the extra 20% spell damage. The 2-pet setup is really only viable like this if you want to use Crystal Fragments as your spammable. Otherwise, you'd want to drop the Volatile Familiar and go to a 1-pet setup to have a little more wiggle room. So in this case, you could slot Bound Aegis for the flat stats, Mage's Wrath for an execute, or a separate spammable such as Force Pulse maybe, and then just use Crystal Fragments for its secondary proc. And then on the back bar, we have a little more room to add in Barbed Trap or Channeled Acceleration. I do recommend Zogvin or Medusa for that first scenario there if you aren't already at the crit cap, since we don't have room for Minor Force in that setup. And then for the second setup, we do have a little more flexibility to slot it, but if you don't need it, you can also just do another skill, maybe Mystic Orb there, or whatever you need really in that slot. And then finally, if you do happen to have a Dragonite in the group who is casting Igneous Weapons, this gives us Major Sorcery and Brutality for that 20% spell and weapon damage. So this what we would normally be providing for ourselves with our potions or Degeneration or Crit Surge. So this does give us a little more wiggle room as well for maybe a hard-hitting AoE ability like Mystic Orb. Alright, and then finally for the skills, I'll go through an AoE skill setup. If you're just wanting to run one skill bar setup throughout, you can definitely do that. I generally advise going with one of the boss setups and then maybe slotting an extra AoE skill or using Unstable Wall as your AoE spammable. But this setup will be more for if you're wanting to change your setups completely for AoE heavy encounters. So on our front bar, we have Bound Aegis for the flat stat boost, Camo Hunter for the stat boost, Inner Light for the stat boost, and then Pulsar or Elemental Ring for our main AoE spammable. And then that last slot will have a little wiggle room depending on your preferences. You can go with Daedric Tomb, which hits really hard but only has 3 mines that hit at a time, so not as strong when you are going up against more enemies than that. This also procs Minor Prophecy for your group, giving them 6% spell crit chance, but Dark Conversion can be nice as well to proc the Minor Prophecy for the group. Mage's Wrath is nice if you aren't using Flame Pulsar, since Pulsar has a built-in execute already, but if you are using a shock version or a different spammable altogether, Mage's Wrath can be nice to finish enemies off, or you can always just slot a Fighter's Guild ability here for the passive stats. And then on the back bar, we have Proximity Detonation, Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Lightning Flood. You could also slot Dark Conversion here depending on what you have on your front bar, Channeled Acceleration, and then Fiery Rage for our ultimate. So let's go through a few notes about this. Pulsar can be replaced with Shot Clinch if you are using the Master's Lightning Staff. As I mentioned before, Dark Conversion is nice to give the group Minor Prophecy, and you can easily pre-buff it before the pulls even start. Channeled Acceleration can be dropped for whatever other skill you need if you are running Medusa or Zogvin, or you're already at the crit cap. And then for Proxy Det, you do need to be hitting at least 3 targets with its explosion for it to be worth running. It is also a melee ability, so it can be dropped for something else if you can't be close enough for it to hit. For Lightning Flood, my general rule of thumb is that if it's going to get its full duration off in a pool, I'll cast it, but if it ends up being a little shorter pool, maybe only 8 to 10 seconds long, I generally don't bother with it and cast my wall and orb and then just spam away. So a rough preview of what this rotation might look like with the AoE setup: you'd pre-buff Channeled Acceleration, pre-buff Dark Conversion, and Proxy Det, and then you'll cast your orb as you're running in, drop your Destra ult, place your Lightning Flood if you are running that, or straight to your Unstable Wall if you're not. And then you'll swap to your front bar and just start spamming your AoE spammable that you're using. Not too difficult overall, but could take a few times through to get the timing of everything down. Alright, now I'll go through some combat rotations. First, I'll go through the dynamic rotation, then I'll cover a couple of static options, and then finally a beginner rotation. So first up, this is what I used in the majority of my parses that were using Bahsei's Mania. For the pre-buff, I was using Seed Shield as a Magicka dump to have my Magicka really low for Bahsei, and then pre-casting Channeled Acceleration so I don't have to cast Barbed Trap quite as quickly. So you will need to make sure you're staying far enough back where you don't hit the dummy or the boss you are facing as you are pre-casting these skills. So we'll start with casting our Twilight Tormentor, Hurricane, or Boundless Storm, depending on which morph you have. Drop our ultimate off to the side so it doesn't hit the target yet. Cast our Volatile Familiar, and here's where we'd open up with our trap cast if we aren't pre-buffing Channel Acceleration. Otherwise, you'll start the opening section with your Light Attack Weaving on Unstable Wall, bar swap to the front bar, cast our Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, Daedric Prey, 1 spammable, and then the Volatile Familiar. At this point, we are reapplying our Unstable Wall here and keeping up all of our abilities dynamically on their own individual timers. The priority order, if you have multiple running out near the same time, is Unstable Wall, then Daedric Prey, Secondary Frag Proc, Barbed Trap, Volatile Familiar, and then Hurricane or Boundless. So the Twilight Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff, and then we don't touch it again for the rest of the fight. It will just passively do damage for us. If there are like immunity phases or sections where the boss teleports and you have some time where you aren't dealing damage anyway, you can recast it in that transition, and as long as the target is still over 50% health. We'll cast our ultimate ability whenever it is ready, and none of our high priority dots need recasting. Our spammable is our lowest priority cast, so when nothing else needs to be reapplied, that's what we're casting then. Mystic Orb is really hard to sustain on the trial dummy, but definitely should be added in on top of this or in place of Hurricane when it is sustainable, and the priority for that will go right around where your frag procs are if you do have that added in. If you're running Zogvin or Medusa, or you're just already at the crit cap, you can just ignore Barbed Trap here. If you aren't running an Execute, you'll just continue this throughout and keep all of your abilities up all the way through. If you do have Mage's Wrath or the Endless Fury morph slotted, you will change up a bit once you hit 20% health remaining on the target. So we'll drop all of our dots except Unstable Wall and Barbed Trap. If you are running Boundless Storm, you can keep that up as well, assuming you are getting the full duration out of it. If you're going to get less than 18 seconds from it, don't bother recasting. And then if you're running the Stamina Hurricane morph, you can drop that altogether unless you need to cast it for the sustain help. And I didn't write it here, but if you are running Mystic Orb, you can keep that skill going as well. Another note, if you're wanting to get really picky with it, you can recast your Daedric Prey in Execute if and only if your Storm Atro ultimate is going. Otherwise, you'll stop casting it at 20%. And then we'll just spam Mage's Wrath in place of our regular spammable that we were using. You can also continue casting the Secondary Frag Proc when that pops up. It is roughly the same damage as the Mage's Wrath cast, however it is cheaper and gives us Minor Prophecy for the group, so depending on your sustain and how long it's been since your last cast of it, you might need to hit it to make sure you're still giving that buff out. The Minor Prophecy lasts 20 seconds though, so you don't necessarily have to hit it every time it pops up, but it is a lot cheaper like I said, so you might want to keep hitting it to keep your Magicka from running out. And that's pretty much it for the dynamic version. Again, if you aren't running an Execute, just ignore this whole last section and continue all of your skills throughout. So this second version here, I won't run through all of it. It's pretty much the same, except this is if you're using Degen or Mystic Orb instead of Hurricane or Boundless Storm. The pre-buff and opening were just slightly different, so I wanted to include this here too, and I'll have this all down in the description. Alright, the first static rotation I'll go through is a 12-second version. I really like this one for those that are getting into dynamic rotations, but maybe not all the way ready for everything to be dynamic. This one really allows us some wiggle room to cast everything static, or to start working some stuff in dynamically to work towards the end goal of eventually doing everything dynamically. So we'll start pretty similar to our last setup with our Twilight Tormentor, our ultimate, the Scamp, and Barbed Trap, or you can just ignore that trap cast if you pre-cast Channeled Acceleration. And then the repeating section will be Daedric Prey, Unstable Wall, Degeneration, 3 spammables, Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, and then we'll start over with Daedric Prey again. This is pretty nice, especially if you are doing Crystal Fragments as your spammable, because we'll always end the front bar with the Daedric Prey cast, and therefore never have to bar swap off of that 0.8 second cast time that Crystal Fragments has. It's also set up in a way where Daedric Prey always pops on the front bar where our stats are higher. So like the previous rotations, the Tormentor is only cast as a pre-buff, the Storm Atro is cast whenever ready in place of one of our spammable casts, so Barbed Trap is one of the skills we are keeping up dynamically. However, if you want to do it static, you could cast it every back bar, but it will be overcast doing that at 12 seconds instead of 18 seconds, and a bit of a DPS loss. If you are running Zogvin or Medusa though, or you're already at the crit cap, you can just ignore Barbed Trap altogether. And then you might have noticed that the Volatile Familiar wasn't in the rotation to the left. With this being a 12-second rotation and the Familiar on a 10-second timer, ideally, we will keep up the Scamp dynamically every time his timer runs out in place of one of our spammables. This and Trap are what I was referring to earlier when I was saying that this is a good introduction into starting to do some dynamically cast abilities. You don't have to do this though. You could cast your Scamp once every time you go to the front bar, so it would be Unstable Wall, Degeneration, Bar Swap, and then cast the Scamp. And then he will just have a couple of seconds of downtime each time through. That's definitely an option though if you aren't comfortable casting it dynamically. And then there is also the option to just not cast it at all. I'd only recommend this really if your sustain is really poor. It does do some nice damage to actually have it active, but in scenarios where you might be running out of Magicka, you can bypass casting it and let it hold off for a little bit, or just not cast it at all if you're not quite comfortable with that yet. You could also do Hurricane here, like I mentioned in the previous rotations, if you're having real sustain issues or trying to hold your Magicka really low for Bahsei's Mania. You do overcast it a bit with it being static, so could be another option to change to dynamic as well if you're comfortable doing so. Otherwise, you'll just cast it every 12 seconds at the same time you cast your wall. And you could also run Mystic Orb in Degeneration spot as well if you don't have sustain issues at all. So the downsides to this static version: 12-second rotation means you lose some uptime on your Unstable Wall and your Scamp if you are casting the Scamp static as well. But the upside is that we are casting Daedric Prey every 6 seconds to get the full uptime on it. And if you want to run an Execute, just refer to the Execute section in the previous dynamic rotations, as the skills you'll keep will be the same. So like I said, I think this is a nice one for someone that wants to go static, but maybe wants to eventually get more skills cast dynamically, as it allows for that wiggle room to do either with some of the abilities. And you can slowly work towards a point where you're casting more and more of your abilities on their own cooldowns. The next rotation is a full static rotation that's 20 seconds long. I didn't parse with this one this patch, but nothing has changed with these skills, so it will still work just the same. The opening is the same as the previous rotation, and then the repeating section will be Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Daedric Prey, 5 spammables, Daedric Prey, Volatile Familiar, and then back to the back bar to reapply our Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, then Barbed Trap, and bar swap back to the front bar and do 3 spammables, Daedric Prey, 2 spammables, and the Volatile Familiar. So I really like how this is set up, because similar to the last rotation, if you are using Crystal Fragments as your spammable, you never have to bar swap off of that with this rotation. You always will end with the Scamp cast. Another thing too is that the way this is set up, Daedric Prey should always pop on your front bar where your stats are higher. So most of the notes are the same here as with the other rotations too. Degeneration can be used if you need some extra sustain help. You can also do Boundless and just alternate that with Barbed Trap every other back bar if you want. That works too. So the main downside to this rotation is that since it is 20 seconds and your Daedric Prey is 6 seconds, you're going to lose a little uptime on that to keep it static. So you'll notice after our first cast of it, we're casting it on cooldown, but then the next cast after that is actually delayed 2 seconds from when it is ready. This keeps it from popping while we're on our back bar reapplying our dots and makes it line up statically. Barbed Trap also loses a couple of seconds if you are casting it in the same spot every time, since it is on an 18-second timer and the rotation is 20 seconds long. And then the upside to the rotation is that our Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, and the Scamp are all cast every 10 seconds and therefore get great uptimes, and the rotation is really easy to do without having to keep up with skill timers. And then finally, we'll go through a beginner rotation. I used this one to get 101k DPS, and I used no trial gear with this either, which I'll go over later. I figured with a beginner rotation, it might be a little misrepresentative to use Bahsei and dump mag, as that's more of an end game tactic. But if you did go that route, you could probably do like 107, 108k with this rotation, I'd imagine. So our opening is just casting our pets, Twilight Tormentor, the Volatile Familiar, and the Storm Atro Ultimate. And ideally these are all cast before we initiate combat. Zogvin or Medusa are highly recommended with this setup to avoid needing to keep up a minor force skill as well. So the repeating section will be Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Daedric Prey, 6 spammables, and then end with Volatile Familiar. So some notes on this, the first 2 are the same as in all of these, and then Channel Acceleration can be cast before the start if you aren't running a combo with Zogvin or Medusa. It's pretty nice on short fights as Channeled will last for 36 seconds, so if the enemy is lasting less than that, it will be going for the full duration. But if you don't want to keep up Trap or wear Zogvin or Medusa, you could continue to cast Channel Acceleration after it runs out each time. And then again, like in the other situations, Degeneration can be used instead of Mystic Orb for some sustain help. You could also do something like Boundless Storm and just cast it every other time you go back to reapply your wall. The main downside to this rotation is the Daedric Prey uptime. We're only casting it once per 10-second rotation instead of keeping it up on its 6-second timer. If you are comfortable working this in dynamically, it's a good place to start to begin advancing your rotation skills, but even just once each time through is still good enough to get some good damage out of it. And then the upside to this rotation is that we have really good Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, and Volatile Familiar uptime, since those are all on 10-second timers. So before I play a few clips of the builds in action on the trial dummy, I just wanted to show the different setups that I tested out. I will have this linked in the description as well, and within this sheet you'll be able to click on each one and see the combat metrics report for it. Bahsei and Kinra's did get me my highest parse, with Bahsei and Pillar of Nirn very close behind. Like I mentioned earlier, I really do like Pillar of Nirn for situations where you don't want a build-up phase, and I think it could compete with Kinra's in a lot of places. Zogvin doesn't parse very well on the trial dummy. It does have a line of penetration on it that ends up wasted, and then getting minor force on the dummy isn't really good either because we don't have a lot of sustainable skills to replace Barbed Trap with. So don't let the lower numbers on the dummy fool you. It is still a really nice set to run for most content in the game. The highest non-kilt parse I got was with Guyalnar at 112.5k, and Maw of the Infernal was really close behind that one as well. Unfortunately, I forgot to record the Guyalnar one on video, so I'll show the Maw one later instead. And then that slightly out of norm setup I mentioned in the gear section earlier with Pillar of Nirn on the back bar and Sororia on the front bar with Maw of the Infernal and the kilt. This one actually got up to 111k DPS. This was the highest I got with a non-Bahsei setup. I was pretty shocked this one did so well. Pretty much you end up trading the Maelstrom Staff for the Maw of the Infernal with this build. I thought it was kind of cool though, and something a little different from what we normally see. And then the fourth one down is the semi-static rotation that I showed, and the one at the very bottom is the beginner rotation. So I wanted to try and parse with some of the other rotations as well, not just the dynamic. No, I am a bit more comfortable with the full dynamic at this point. But like I said, this will be linked in the description, and all of the combat metrics reports will be accessible within if you want to look through them, as I won't show videos of every single one of these parses. Alright, that's going to do it for this guide. Hope this helps you get the most out of your Magicka Sorcerer for the Deadlands DLC. Thank you so much for stopping by, and a big thank you to my current Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see how you can help support the channel through Patreon, I'll have a link in the description below. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Privy League Guild on PlayStation's EU server, Cougar's Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, and my wonderful wife. I'll close this one out with a few parses using the setups I showcased. Thanks so much for stopping by. I'll see you in the next one. Bye. $80.